I'm Hannah Miller, 27 years old, and the image of my parents hauling my grandfather's belongings out to the curb will never leave me. His leather chair, his old books, even the framed photos of his wedding were tossed beside the trash cans like yesterday's junk. I stood in the driveway, frozen, clutching my keys, listening to the sound of shattered glass as one of my father's boxes hit the pavement. My grandfather didn't argue or shout. He only looked at them with the calmest expression I'd ever seen and said, 3 days. That's all it will take. Then he turned and walked down the street, leaving behind a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever watched someone you love get treated unfairly and couldn't say a word. My grandfather, Richard Miller, had lived with us since I was a teenager. After Grandma passed, he sold his own home and moved into ours at my father's suggestion, though I always suspected it was Richard who had quietly covered the cost of the house in the first place. He was gentle, polite, the kind of man who remembered every neighbor's birthday and fixed broken porch steps without being asked. I'd grown up hearing his stories about building a small manufacturing business from the ground up, how he believed in hard work and honesty, even when it didn't pay off right away. To me, he wasn't just family. He was a reminder that integrity mattered, no matter how loud or selfish the world became. My parents were a different story. My father, Stephen, had always chased recognition that never quite came. He blamed his father for hovering, for being too proud, for reminding him what he owed. My mother, Diane, carried that bitterness like perfume, sweet on the surface, sharp underneath. She loved dinner parties, expensive handbags, and showing off the house she claimed was theirs, though I knew better. Between the two of them, Grandpa's kindness looked more like weakness, something to be controlled or discarded when inconvenient. That Sunday afternoon felt wrong from the moment I stepped out of my car. The late sunlight spilled over the driveway, catching on the silver edges of torn boxes. Silk ties fluttered in the breeze like ribbons from another life. My father's voice cut through the still air as he tossed another carton toward the curb. "Dad, this is for your own good," he snapped. My mother stood beside him, arms folded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I wanted to scream at them to stop, but my voice caught somewhere deep in my throat. Grandpa stood a few feet away, his back straight, his silver hair bright in the sun. There was sadness in his eyes. Yes, but also something else, something steady and unyielding. When he turned to me, his voice softened for just a heartbeat. "Remember this moment, Hannah," he said quietly. "They think they're rid of me. They're not." Then he walked away, leaving the wind and the rattling of broken glass behind him. Inside the house felt different, colder. My parents moved through the rooms as if nothing had happened, laughing about how they'd finally have their space back. At dinner, I couldn't eat. Every scrape of a fork against the plate made me think of Grandpa's chair sitting empty, the lamp he used to read by lying bent beside the trash cans. When I finally spoke, my voice trembled, but didn't break. "How could you do that to him?" I asked. My father didn't look up. "He's lived off us long enough," he muttered. "It's time we lived our own lives." I tried to remind them of everything he'd done, the mortgage payments, the repairs, even the tuition checks he'd quietly written when they said we couldn't afford it. But my mother waved her hand dismissively. "He was holding us back," she said, her tone crisp as ice. "This family needs freedom." The word freedom hung in the air like poison. I pushed my plate away and whispered, "You're wrong. He's stronger than you think." That night I couldn't sleep. Through the rain-streaked window I could still see the heap of his belongings, dark and heavy under the streetlight. Every creak of the house made me flinch. My parents spoke in hushed tones downstairs, words like "crawl back embarrassment" and "no one can know." I didn't yet understand what they were afraid of, but I knew one thing for certain: Grandpa's warning wasn't empty. Whatever he meant by those 3 days, something was already in motion. When the morning came, the air in the house felt different again, brittle, charged. My mother answered the first call, her cheerful tone vanishing, the moment the voice on the other end asked for Richard Miller. Another call followed, then another. Banks, attorneys, people who never used to call our home at all. My father told her to hang up, but his hand shook as he set the phone back in its cradle. By that afternoon, the confidence in their voices had faded into tight whispers and restless pacing. I stood by the window looking at the curb, where Grandpa's leather chair still sat, rain soaking through the cushion. I thought about his calm voice, the strange certainty in his eyes, and I realized he hadn't left defeated. He had left ready. That was the moment the unease settled deep in my stomach, the feeling that my parents had made a mistake they couldn't undo. They had thrown away more than a man. They had tossed aside the foundation beneath their own lives, and though I couldn't yet name it, I felt something shifting quietly, like the first distant rumble before a storm. The next morning felt heavy, like the air itself carried the weight of what we'd done. The rain had stopped, but the street outside still gleamed with puddles that mirrored the heap of my grandfather's things piled beside the trash cans. The leather chair he loved so much sat tilted on its side, its legs splintered, the seats soaked through. Every time I glanced out the window, I felt that same dull ache rise in my chest, but my parents moved through the kitchen as if the pile outside didn't exist. Dad hummed softly while reading the paper, pretending to be relaxed. Mom scrolled through her phone, her nails tapping against the screen. The smell of coffee filled the room, but the usual comfort it brought wasn't there. It all felt wrong. I wanted to ask where Grandpa had gone, if they even knew, but I already knew the answer. They hadn't looked for him. They didn't care to. When I couldn't take it anymore, I set down my mug. "How could you do that to him?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Dad lowered his paper, just enough for me to see the irritation in his eyes. "Don't start, Hannah." He made his choice. I stared at him, my throat tightening. His choice. You threw him out of his own home. Mom sighed, shaking her head as if I were a child refusing to understand simple math. "You're too young to see it clearly." He was holding us back. We couldn't live our lives with him watching every move. Her tone was light, but her words landed like stones. "He paid for this house," I said quietly. "He helped you when you needed it most. That's not holding you back." Dad folded the newspaper with a sharp snap. "We didn't ask for his charity," he said. "He wanted to be here and he overstayed his welcome. He's your father," I said, the frustration trembling in my voice. "You talk about him like he's some stranger who wandered in." Mom didn't look up from her phone. "He's old, sweetheart. It's not cruel to want peace in your own home." "Peace?" I repeated, my voice catching. "You mean freedom from gratitude, from decency from him?" Dad's chair scraped across the floor as he stood towering over me. "Enough," he said sharply. "You'll respect your mother and me in this house." But the word house didn't sound right anymore, not when the man who made it a home had been pushed out into the cold. That night, the sound of the wind against the windows kept me awake. I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's words, 3 days. That's all it will take. What did he mean? Where would he go? I pulled a blanket tighter around myself and stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines in the plaster until the shadows began to blur. Somewhere below, I heard voices, low, urgent. My parents were still awake. I slipped quietly to the top of the stairs and leaned against the wall, careful not to make a sound. "He'll come crawling back," Mom whispered. "He always does." "And if he doesn't?" Dad asked. His tone was different this time, shaky, uncertain. "Then we make sure no one else hears his side," she said. "We can't afford questions. Not now." My breath caught. They weren't just heartless, they were hiding something. I crept back to my room, every step careful and silent. When I closed my door, my hands were trembling. Grandpa hadn't left defeated. He'd left because he knew something they didn't want exposed. By the next morning, the tension in the house had deepened. It was like we were living inside a clock winding too tight. Every tick, every small sound seemed to make my parents flinch. Around mid-morning, the phone rang. Mom answered cheerfully, but the tone of her voice shifted after a few seconds. "He doesn't live here anymore," she snapped and slammed the receiver down. A few minutes later, it rang again, then again. By noon, Dad's knuckles were white around his coffee mug. "Ignore it," he muttered, but his hand trembled as he lifted it to his mouth. The calls kept coming, banks, law offices, numbers with names I didn't recognize. Each time, Mom's face grew paler. By dinner, neither of them could hide their nerves. Mom paced the kitchen, muttering under her breath. "You said he was broke, Stephen. You swore he had nothing left." Dad's voice cracked as he tried to keep it steady. "He didn't. I thought he didn't. He always acted like he was scraping by. Then why are the banks calling, she demanded? Why are lawyers looking for him? I sat silently at the table pretending to scroll through my phone, but every word burned itself into my mind. That night their argument grew louder. From my room I could hear the panic building with each sentence. Words like assets, trusts, and exposure floated up through the vents. I pressed my hand over my mouth, my heart pounding. The next morning, Mom looked like she hadn't slept. Her makeup was smeared, her hair pulled back hastily. She kept checking her phone, reading messages she didn't want Dad to see. I noticed the way they both avoided my eyes as if I'd already seen too much. When I stepped outside later, the pile of Grandpa's belongings was gone. Someone must have taken it during the night. The curb looked bare, like nothing had ever happened, but that emptiness felt louder than any of their arguments. The third day began quietly. I thought maybe it was over, that the calls had stopped, but then the phone rang again. Mom froze, staring at the caller ID. "Private number," she whispered. Dad took the receiver from her hand. "Hello?" His voice cracked halfway through the word. There was a pause. Then his face went white. "Yes," he said, after a moment, his voice shaking. "I understand." He hung up slowly, his fingers stiff. "What was it?" Mom asked. He didn't answer. That evening I stood by the window again, looking out at the street. The light was fading and the first stars were beginning to show. I could hear the faint hum of cars, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the block. The world outside felt normal, but everything inside our house had shifted. When I turned, I saw my parents standing in the living room whispering again, their faces pale under the lamplight. "He's not who you think he is," Mom said, her voice breaking. "Who is he?" Then I asked, stepping closer. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Dad's eyes darted toward me, full of something I couldn't name. Fear, guilt, maybe both. "Go to your room, Hannah," he said, his voice firm but hollow. I didn't move. "Tell me what's going on." But neither of them did. The silence that followed said more than any confession could have. That night I couldn't sleep again. I sat on the edge of my bed with my heart pounding and the echo of Grandpa's voice in my head. 3 days. His words felt heavier now, as if each hour had been counted long before any of us knew what was coming. By dawn, the air in the house had gone still. The phone didn't ring, and my parents didn't speak. It was the kind of quiet that made you hold your breath without realizing it. I poured a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the empty street. Somewhere out there, my grandfather was waiting just like he said he would. And whatever truth he'd promised would come to light, I knew it was closer than any of us were ready for. By the next morning, the unease in the house had turned into something almost physical. You could feel it the moment you stepped into the hallway. The air was too still, the quiet too sharp. My parents moved as if afraid of their own footsteps. Mom flinched every time the phone rang, and Dad had started pacing between the living room and the kitchen, muttering under his breath about timing and exposure. I sat at the dining table pretending to check emails, but I couldn't look away from them. It was like watching two people trapped in a storm they'd created themselves. The first call came just after breakfast. The landline blared through the silence and Mom lunged for it. Her usual bright voice wavered as she said hello. After a moment, her tone shifted brittle and tense. "He doesn't live here anymore," she snapped before slamming the phone down hard enough to rattle the table. A few seconds later, it rang again. Then again. Dad picked up this time, his jaw tight. "Yes, this is Stephen Miller," he said. He listened for a few seconds, then his expression changed. "I told you he moved out," he said quickly. "No, I don't have his new number." When he hung up, he didn't meet my eyes. It didn't stop. Call after call, banks' law offices numbers from different states. Once I heard him mutter, "Private Wealth Division," under his breath, before ending the call mid-sentence. By noon, the lines were so tangled with confusion and fear that neither of them could keep their stories straight. That night, the argument started. From my room, I could hear every word echo through the thin walls. "You said he was broke," Mom hissed. "You swore he had nothing left." "I thought he didn't." Dad shouted back. He acted like he was living on fumes. "All those bills, those debts." He played it up. Then why are lawyers calling us? I could almost see her pacing, one manicured hand pressed to her forehead. Maybe he hid something, Dad said. His voice dropped lower, desperate. Maybe he still had money stashed somewhere. Then we find it before he uses it against us, she snapped. I closed my eyes and pressed the pillow over my ears, but their voices still seeped through. Each word confirmed what I had begun to suspect. They weren't worried about Grandpa's well-being. They were terrified of what he still controlled. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, but it didn't feel warm. Dad's hands shook as he poured his coffee. Mom sat at the table, her phone buzzing constantly beside her. "They're asking for him again," she whispered. "A man from a bank. Then someone from a firm in Chicago. They want to verify his holdings." Dad didn't answer. He just stared into his mug like he was trying to see the bottom. When the doorbell rang around lunchtime, all three of us froze. None of us moved. Finally, Mom stood and smoothed her blouse before peeking through the window. No one was there, just an envelope on the porch sealed and addressed to Richard Miller. She hesitated before picking it up, turning it over in her hands. The return label bore the name of a law office downtown. Dad took it from her quickly, his voice rough. "Don't open it." "Stephen, if this is—" I said, "Don't," he snapped. I watched as he tossed it into the junk drawer and slammed it shut. That sound echoed louder than anything else in the room. By evening, the tension had become unbearable. I escaped to my room and stared out at the street where neighbors were setting out garbage bins and calling to their kids. Everything looked so normal out there. Inside, it felt like our house was closing in. Around midnight, I heard movement downstairs. I crept out and peered down the hallway. The glow from the kitchen light spilled across the floor. My parents were sitting at the table, their faces pale and drawn. "He'll ruin us," Mom whispered. "He can't," Dad said, though his tone carried no conviction. "He's old. What can he do?" "You don't get it," she said. "If those papers surface, if anyone finds out, we lose everything." I stepped back quietly before they saw me. Papers, I thought. What papers? Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa's calm expression as he said those words 3 days. On the third day, the panic broke wide open. The phone didn't stop ringing. The doorbell chimed twice before noon. Mom started crying at one point, saying she couldn't breathe, that people were asking questions she couldn't answer. Dad tried to keep control, but his voice cracked when he barked orders. "Turn off the phones. Block the calls. We'll figure this out." I walked into the living room and froze. Both of them were standing by the window, whispering furiously. "If he exposes us, we lose everything," Mom said, her voice shaking. "What do you mean, exposes us?" I asked. They turned in unison. "Hannah, go back to your room," Dad said sharply. "No," I said. "Tell me what you're afraid of. Why does everyone suddenly want Grandpa?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes darted toward Mom. "He's not who you think he is," she said quietly. "Then who is he?" Silence. She swallowed hard, glancing toward Dad before whispering, "He's not just an old man living off us. Her voice broke. She didn't finish. "Enough," Dad said firmly, gripping her arm. "Not now." I stood there, my heartbeat thudding in my ears, but they said nothing else. Whatever truth they were hiding hung between us like smoke. That night, I couldn't stand it anymore. While they argued behind their locked bedroom door, I slipped quietly down to the basement. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air. Against the far wall, stacked neatly in the corner, were the boxes Grandpa had kept, boxes my parents had never touched. I knelt down and opened the first one. Inside were folders neatly labeled in his careful handwriting. My fingers brushed over the top file, private accounts. I hesitated, then opened it. What I saw made my hands go cold. Bank statements, investment records, property deeds. Each page stamped with official seals and staggering numbers. I opened another folder, shares in companies I recognized from the news. Another folder held trust documents. My name was printed on one of them right under the word beneficiary. I sank onto the floor, the papers trembling in my hands. My grandfather hadn't been broke at all. He wasn't dependent on anyone. He was protecting something far greater than any of us had imagined. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. I shoved the folders back into the box and stood just as Dad appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, his voice low and sharp. "What are you doing down here?" "I was looking for my old yearbook," I said quickly. His eyes flicked toward the boxes. For a moment, I thought he'd grab them, but he didn't. Instead, he clenched his jaw. "Stay out of this, Hannah. You don't know what's at stake." "Yes, I do," I said before I could stop myself. "You kicked out the one person who held this family together." His mouth tightened. "You don't understand." "I understand enough," I said quietly. I brushed past him and ran upstairs, clutching one folder close against my chest. When I reached my room, I locked the door and spread the papers across the bed. Every line, every number, told the same story my grandfather hadn't been powerless, he'd been preparing. Outside the house was silent again. But it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that comes right before everything changes. And deep down, I knew Grandpa's countdown was almost over. By dawn, I hadn't slept. The papers I found were still spread across my bed like a map of secrets, each line, each signature telling a story I'd never been meant to read. I sat there with the early light creeping through the blinds, the edges of the documents catching gold in the sunrise. My grandfather's handwriting was on several pages, precise, confident, deliberate. Every detail had been planned, every decision carefully hidden. The truth felt too big for the quiet of my room. From behind my door, I heard my parents' voices again. They'd been arguing since before sunrise, their words sharp and brittle. Phrases like trust accounts, missing signatures, and liquid assets drifted down the hall. I stuffed the folders into my backpack and zipped it shut, my pulse quickening as I stepped into the hallway. I couldn't stay there any longer. I slipped out of the house without a sound, the cold air biting at my cheeks. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that I needed answers, and Grandpa was the only one who could give them to me. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as I reached the end of the block. The screen flashed with an unknown number. "Hannah," a familiar voice said when I answered. "Grandpa?" My heart leapt. "Meet me downtown," he said, his tone even and calm. "Robert Chen's office. Don't tell your parents." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, staring at the quiet street. Then I tightened my grip on the bag and started walking. The city felt different that morning, alive, humming with a kind of energy I couldn't name. When I reached the address, I stopped in front of a brick building with polished brass doors and a plaque that read Chen and Wallace Law Offices. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. A receptionist led me through a quiet hallway to a private room. And there he was. Grandpa sat by the window, dressed in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, his silver hair neatly combed back. He looked nothing like the man my parents had thrown out. There was no trace of defeat in his posture. He turned when I walked in, and for the first time in days, his eyes softened. "You found the papers," he said. I nodded, still clutching the strap of my bag. I didn't mean to, but I had to know. He motioned for me to sit. "I wanted you to." The man beside him stood and extended his hand. "Robert Chen," he introduced himself. His voice was measured, confident, the kind that made people listen. "Your grandfather speaks very highly of you." I shook his hand and sat down across from them. My pulse raced as I looked between them. "Grandpa," I said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell us the truth?" He leaned back, folding his hands on the table. "Because truth has a strange way of revealing character," he said. "People show who they are when they believe they have nothing left to gain." I stared at him, trying to take it all in, the calmness in his tone, the way he seemed almost at peace. "You let them think you were broke," I said. "I needed to see what love looked like without money," he replied. "And now I've seen." Robert Chen slid a thick file across the table. Inside were legal documents stamped with official seals, notarized and signed. "Mr. Miller has authorized a full transfer of assets," he said. "You are listed as the primary heir to his estate." I blinked, unsure I'd heard him right. "To me." "Yes," Grandpa said. "Everything. The properties, the accounts, the investments." My hands trembled slightly as I looked at the papers. "But why? What about Dad, Mom?" He studied me for a long moment before answering. They made their choice when they treated me like a burden. You, Hannah, you're the only one who still saw me as a person. I shook my head slowly. They're going to hate me for this. They already do, he said softly, because you remind them of what they lost when they stopped valuing what mattered. Robert cleared his throat gently. Once you sign, the transfer is immediate, he explained. The deeds, the accounts, everything will fall under your name. Mr. Miller will retain advisory rights, but legal ownership will pass to you. I looked down at the pen in front of me. It felt heavier than it should have. Grandpa reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His skin was warm, steady. This isn't revenge, he said. It's correction. Sometimes you have to let people live with the truth they created. I nodded, my eyes burning. When I signed my name, the sound of the pen scratching across the page felt like the closing of a door that had stood open too long. When the final signature was done, Robert gathered the documents carefully. It's official, he said. Congratulations, Ms. Miller. The title didn't feel real yet. I looked at Grandpa, who was watching me with quiet pride. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, standing slowly, we see what they do when the truth finds them. As we left the office, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the sidewalks. Grandpa walked beside me, his steps unhurried. For a man who had been thrown out of his home just days before, he carried himself like someone who'd finally reclaimed his peace. Grandpa, I said after a moment when you told them 3 days, you already knew all of this would happen, didn't you? He smiled faintly. I didn't know the details, he said, but I knew their choices would reveal everything. They always do. We stopped at the corner waiting for the light to change. The city moved around us, people rushing horns, blaring the hum of everyday life untouched by what had just happened. He turned toward me, then his expression softer. You did well, Hannah, he said quietly. Whatever comes next, remember truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. When I got home that evening, the house was in chaos. The phones were ringing again, louder than ever. Dad's voice thundered from the living room as he argued with someone on speakerphone. Mom sat at the kitchen table, pale and shaking, clutching a glass of water with both hands. They're saying the deed isn't in our name, she whispered when she saw me, that the house belongs to him. But that can't be true, right? Tell me that's not true. I didn't answer. Dad turned toward me, his face red with fury and panic. Where have you been? Out, I said. What do you know? He demanded. I set my bag down slowly and met his eyes. I know the truth, Dad. Grandpa owns everything this house, the cars, the accounts. You didn't lose control. You never had it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mom laughed, a thin, brittle sound. He's punishing us through you, she said. You think inheriting his scraps makes you better than us? They're not scraps, I said quietly. They're his life's work. Her expression hardened, but she didn't argue. Dad looked between us, his breathing shallow. You'll fix this, he said. You'll talk to him, make him stop. I shook my head. You made your choice 3 days ago. The silence that followed was heavy enough to fill the room. Upstairs, I closed my door and leaned against it, the sound of their muffled voices fading behind me. The house no longer felt like theirs. It wasn't even mine yet, but something in me had changed. The storm that had started the day they threw Grandpa out was still gathering strength. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The house was different that night. It wasn't the silence that felt strange. It was the sound beneath it. The faint whir of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards under my father's restless pacing. Every noise felt sharper, as if the walls themselves were listening. The documents I had signed earlier that day were still folded in my bag upstairs, and though I hadn't yet told them, I knew they could feel the shift. Something between us had changed forever. When I came downstairs for water, Dad was sitting in the dark living room, his elbows resting on his knees. The glow from the streetlight cut across his face, showing the tension in his jaw. Mom was curled on the couch beside him, her phone lying face down on the cushion. Neither of them looked at me until I spoke. You're still up. Dad lifted his head, his voice low and rough. Couldn't sleep. Mom's eyes flicked toward me, guarded. "You talked to him today, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "He called me." Her voice sharpened. "And what did he say?" "That you'd get what you earned." For a moment, no one moved. The air between us thickened. Then Dad stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "He's manipulating you, Hannah. He's been doing it for years, pretending to be frail, pretending to need us. He wanted you on his side. He didn't pretend I said. He tested you." His eyes flared. "You think you know everything now? You're just a kid, caught in the middle of something you don't understand?" I met his gaze. "No, I finally do understand." The muscles in his jaw tightened, and he turned away, muttering something under his breath as he left the room. Mom didn't follow him. She just sat there silent, tracing the seam of the couch with one finger. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," but it already had. By morning, the calls had started again, louder, more insistent. Mom stopped answering. Dad slammed his phone against the table so hard that the screen cracked. I made myself coffee and watched as they argued across the kitchen island, their voices rising and falling in waves. "They're saying the house isn't in our name," Mom cried, "that the deed lists him." "Then it's a mistake," Dad snapped, though his voice trembled. "I'll handle it." But even he didn't sound convinced. When the landline rang again, I saw the color drain from his face. He stared at the caller ID, then let it ring until the sound stopped. I glanced over his shoulder and caught a glimpse of the name Robert Chen. That afternoon, I received a call of my own. Grandpa's calm voice filled my ear. "Hannah, bring them to Robert's office tomorrow morning. It's time to settle this." "I don't think they'll come," I said. "They will," he replied. Desperation always finds its way to the door. When I told them that evening, Mom's reaction was immediate. "He wants to talk fine. Let him explain himself." She grabbed her purse like she was heading into battle. Dad said nothing for a long time, then finally muttered, "We'll go." The next morning, the car ride downtown was silent, except for the turn signal ticking at red lights. Mom stared out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Dad's hands were tight around the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. I sat in the back seat, clutching my bag and watching the city rise ahead of us. When we arrived, Robert Chen met us in the lobby, his calm expression unshaken by the tension radiating off my parents. He led us to a large conference room with polished oak walls and wide windows overlooking the city. Grandpa was already there, standing by the far table. He looked steady, composed, every bit the man I remembered before all of this began. My parents froze at the sight of him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dad cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad, we may have acted rashly. Let's talk this through like a family." Grandpa raised a hand, stopping him. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "I'm prepared to offer you one chance," he said. "A public apology here and now. Acknowledgement of what you did, and a promise to change. If you do that, I'll ensure you're provided for modestly. You won't lose everything." Mom's jaw dropped. "You expect us to humiliate ourselves?" "It's not humiliation," Grandpa said evenly. "It's honesty." Dad's face darkened. "You'd strip us of everything after all the years we let you live with us." "Let me." Grandpa's voice rose for the first time, low and thunderous. "I gave you that house. I paid your debts. I carried this family while you pretended to lead it." The room went still. "You didn't let me live with you. I allowed you to live under my roof." Mom's lip trembled, but she lifted her chin. "We don't need your crumbs. We'll build our own life." Grandpa's expression hardened. "Then you'll have nothing. Every account, every possession, every key belongs to me, and as of this week to Hannah." Their eyes snapped to me. The shock on their faces was almost disbelief. "Emily." Mom started, her voice cracking before she caught herself. "You can stop this. Tell him no. Tell him you don't want it." I swallowed hard. "I can't. He made his choice because you made yours." Dad's voice broke into a shout. "We're your parents. You owe us." I shook my head slowly. "No, I don't." Grandpa turned toward Robert Chen. "Draw up the final order." His signature was quick, steady, final. The sound of the pen against paper was like a door closing behind all of us. When it was done, Grandpa slid the folder toward Robert. "List the house immediately," he said. "They have 1 week to vacate." Mom gasped, clutching the edge of the table. Dad stood frozen, his face drained of color. Neither spoke as Grandpa turned to leave. He paused by me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Family is proven by actions, not words," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the morning air felt sharper, clearer somehow. As we stepped onto the sidewalk, Grandpa looked up at the sky and took a long breath. For the first time in years, his shoulders seemed lighter. Back inside, I could hear my parents' voices rising in panic behind the glass doors, pleading, bargaining, refusing to accept what had just happened. But their words no longer carried weight. The tide had already turned. As Grandpa and I walked away, I knew there was no undoing any of it. What had begun as cruelty on the front lawn had come full circle, and now the truth they'd buried was out for everyone to see. The ride home from Robert Chen's office felt longer than it was. No one spoke. The sound of the turn signal filled the car each time my father hesitated at an intersection, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. My mother sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes glassy and unfocused, like she was staring through the windshield, but not seeing the road ahead. I sat in the back, the hum of the engine steady beneath the silence, my stomach twisted into knots. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The curtains were drawn, and the afternoon light made the walls appear dull and tired. For the first time, I noticed how much of it still reflected my grandfather's taste. The framed photographs, the old oak banister, even the smell of cedar polish he used to favor. It wasn't their home. It never had been. My parents walked in first. Mom's heels clicked sharply on the tile as she threw her purse onto the counter. "He can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "He can't just take everything." Dad rubbed a hand over his face, his tone low and bitter. "He already did." I stood by the door, unsure whether to follow them inside or leave altogether. The weight of their voices pulled me in. Mom turned toward me suddenly, her eyes wide with something between anger and desperation. "You have to fix this, Hannah. You're his favorite. Talk to him. Tell him we didn't mean it." "I can't," I said quietly. "You had your chance." Her mouth trembled. "You think you know everything now because he handed you a fortune? You're just a pawn in his game." Dad slammed his fist on the table, making the salt shaker jump. "He set this up to humiliate us, to make us beg." "No," I said softly. "He set it up to see who you really were." The words hung in the air, and for a moment no one moved. My mother's expression hardened. She turned away and started pacing, muttering to herself about lawyers, about loopholes, about getting the deed back. My father just sank into a chair, staring at the floor like he was seeing the pieces of his life scattered there. That night, I heard them arguing again. The words weren't as sharp this time, just broken pieces of conversation, the sound of two people clinging to something already gone. "We'll talk to him," Mom said, her voice hoarse. "He has to listen." "Even if he did," Dad muttered, "it's too late. It's all in her name now." I lay awake in the dark, their words echoing down the hallway. I should have felt vindicated, but all I felt was the hollow quiet of a family crumbling. The next morning, Grandpa called. His voice was calm the way it always was when he had made up his mind. "Hannah, come to the office again," he said. "Bring them with you. We'll end this the right way." "I don't think they'll agree," I said. "They will," he replied. "Fear has a way of forcing people to listen." When I told them, Mom's face changed. Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile but bright. Dad hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Fine," he said. "We'll go, but he's going to hear what we have to say." The drive downtown was heavy with tension. Neither of them spoke until we reached the parking garage. When we stepped out, Mom took my arm, her grip too tight. "You'll help us, won't you?" she asked. "He'll listen to you." I didn't answer. Inside the office, Robert Chen greeted us politely and led us down the hall. The same conference room waited quiet, sunlit, lined with dark wood and stillness. Grandpa stood near the window again, dressed impeccably, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned to face us, his expression was unreadable. Dad broke the silence first. "Dad, this has gone far enough. You've made your point. Now let's talk about fixing this." Grandpa didn't sit. "I'm not here to argue," he said evenly. "I gave you a choice yesterday and you refused it. I came only to close this chapter." Mom stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Please, we're family. We said things we didn't mean. Don't do this to us. You did this to yourselves, he replied. She froze her shoulders, trembling. Dad's face reddened. You think you can just rewrite everything because you've got money. You're not God, old man. Robert Chen cleared his throat. Mr. Miller, everything has already been signed. The transfers are final. The sale of this property begins next week, Mom gasped. Sale? You're selling our home. Grandpa's tone remained steady. My home. You made it clear I wasn't welcome. I won't let it rot in resentment. The words hit harder than any shout could have. My father's jaw worked, but no sound came. Finally, Grandpa turned toward me. Hannah, he said, his voice softening, you'll handle the final arrangements. The funds will move into your account once the sale closes. Keep the documents with Robert. I nodded slowly. Mom covered her face with her hands. Please, Hannah, don't let him do this. We'll change. We'll apologize. Dad looked at me, his voice breaking. We'll have nothing, Hannah. Do you understand? Nothing. I met their eyes and said the only thing that felt true. Now you know how he felt when you threw him out. The room went still. Grandpa took a breath, then signed one last paper Robert placed before him. It's done, he said quietly. He turned to my parents. You may stay until the sale is finalized. After that, you'll leave. Mom's knees buckled slightly, and she sank into a chair. Dad stared at the pen on the table as if he wanted to snap it in half but couldn't summon the strength. When Grandpa walked past me toward the door, he paused. Come by tomorrow, he said softly. There's something I want to show you. I nodded again, unable to speak. He left without another word, his footsteps steady down the hall. Through the glass wall, I watched him disappear around the corner, a man walking out of the shadows of betrayal into the light of his own peace. The three of us stayed in that room long after he was gone. The only sound was my mother's quiet sobbing and the faint hum of the city outside. When we finally stood to leave, Dad muttered, We'll fight this. He doesn't get the last word, but even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. The elevator ride down was silent. As the doors opened to the street, sunlight poured in blinding for a moment. Mom slipped on her sunglasses, hiding her eyes. Dad walked ahead, shoulders hunched. I lingered behind, watching them step into the glare of the afternoon, two figures caught in the wreckage of their own choices. Somewhere above us, my grandfather was probably standing at his office window, calm as ever, knowing the truth had finally spoken for itself. The morning after the meeting, I woke to the sound of drawers slamming and boxes scraping across the floor. My parents were already packing. Sunlight spilled through the windows, soft and golden, but it couldn't brighten the tension that filled every corner of the house. The smell of coffee mingled with the sound of whispered arguments drifting from the hallway. They spoke in short, sharp sentences, their voices brittle with panic. Mom stood at the kitchen counter surrounded by empty cardboard boxes. We have a week, she said, her hands shaking as she wrapped glassware in newspaper. 1 week to figure something out. Dad leaned against the doorway, staring blankly at the floor. There's nothing to figure out. It's his house. He can't just leave us with nothing, she snapped. He already did, he said quietly. I stepped into the kitchen, unsure whether to help or stay out of the way. He gave you a chance to apologize, I said softly. You turned it down. Mom spun around, her eyes red. You don't understand, Hannah. He wanted to humiliate us. No, I said. He wanted honesty. She dropped the dish she was holding, the sound of it breaking sharp against the tile. For a moment, no one moved. Then she crouched to gather the pieces, muttering under her breath. Later that afternoon, I drove to meet Grandpa as he'd asked. His car was parked outside the same law office, but this time he was waiting for me in the small courtyard beside the building. He looked different somehow, lighter, almost peaceful. When he saw me, he smiled faintly and motioned toward a bench. I wanted to thank you for standing by me, he said, and to give you this. He handed me a thick envelope stamped with the name of a financial firm. Inside were official papers, certificates, and a small brass key. What's this for? I asked. The key is to my safe deposit box, he said. Inside are documents and a letter I wrote for you years ago. I never expected you'd need it so soon. I turned the key in my hand, its cool metal pressing into my palm. "You really planned all of this," I said quietly. He nodded. People mistake silence for weakness, but silence gives you time to see who's listening. We sat there for a while, watching the wind stir the leaves above us. "What will you do now?" I asked. He smiled. "Live, travel. I've spent too long waiting for others to do right by me. It's time I do right by myself." When I returned home, the atmosphere had shifted again. Realtors had already begun scheduling viewings, and the sound of strangers' footsteps echoed through the halls. Mom followed them nervously, straightening curtains and dusting surfaces as if any of it would change the outcome. Dad stayed in his office with the door closed, the faint smell of whiskey seeping through the crack beneath it. That evening, I found him sitting alone in the dark living room, staring at a blank TV screen. The lines on his face looked deeper than before. "You think he feels proud of this?" he asked. "Destroying his own family." "He didn't destroy it," I said. "He just stopped protecting what was already broken." He looked at me for a long moment, then turned back to the dark screen. "You sound just like him." Maybe that was true. As the week passed, the house emptied one box at a time. The sound of tape ripping and furniture scraping became the background music of our days. Every night I lay awake listening to the echo of my parents' quiet arguments, the kind that came from exhaustion more than anger. On the last day before the sale, Grandpa asked to meet once more. We sat across from each other in Robert Chen's office. The paperwork was complete, the signatures final. "The proceeds from the sale will go into your account," Robert explained, sliding the folder toward me. Grandpa smiled proudly as I signed. When the last page was done, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a smaller envelope. "One more thing," he said. "This isn't about money. It's about responsibility." Inside was a letter written in his familiar script. "Use this to build something good," it said. "Not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right." I looked up at him, my throat tight. "I will," I whispered. He placed a hand on my shoulder. That's all I needed to hear. That night, as the movers arrived to carry away the last of the furniture, my parents stood together in the doorway, watching strangers take apart the home they'd once claimed as their own. Mom's tears left streaks through her makeup. Dad didn't speak at all. When they turned to me, their voices were soft, pleading, almost childlike. "Please, Hannah," Mom said, "don't let this happen. We can start over. We'll change." I shook my head. "You had that chance. You threw it away just like you threw him away." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. By sunset, the house was empty. The echo of our footsteps on the bare floors was the only sound left. Outside, a young couple stood on the sidewalk, holding hands, looking up at the porch with quiet excitement. They would move in next week. As I handed the keys to the realtor, Mom turned away and pressed a tissue to her eyes. Dad loaded the last box into the trunk and closed it gently. Neither of them looked back as they drove away. I stood on the front lawn watching their car disappear down the street. The evening light stretched long shadows across the yard, touching the place where my grandfather's belongings had once been thrown out like garbage. Now that space felt lighter, almost clean. Grandpa was right. 3 days had been enough to reveal the truth, but it had taken everything else to make it permanent. The morning after my parents drove away, I returned to the house one last time. The new owners had already started moving in, young, cheerful, full of energy. Their laughter floated through the open doorway as sunlight spilled across the floors that used to echo with tension. I stood on the porch for a moment, remembering how it once felt to walk through that door, the smell of coffee in the morning, Grandpa reading the newspaper at the table. For the first time in years, I could picture this house filled with peace instead of resentment. Later that day, I met Grandpa at the lawyer's office for the final paperwork. He looked rested, lighter somehow, like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd carried for too long. "It's all official now," Robert Chen said with a small nod. "The proceeds have cleared and everything's been transferred." Grandpa thanked him and turned to me, his expression gentle. "You've handled this with more grace than I could have asked for," he said. "It's time you make something of your own." We went to lunch afterward, just the two of us. The small cafe near the park had outdoor tables shaded by old trees, their branches swaying gently in the warm breeze. Grandpa ordered tea the same way he always had and smiled at the quiet hum of the street around us. You know, he said, losing everything isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. Sometimes it's the only way they start to see what matters. I listened, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in my chest. He handed me a small envelope neatly sealed. "This is for you," he said. Inside was a letter written in his steady handwriting, the ink slightly smudged where he'd pressed too hard. It wasn't long, but every line carried weight. "Use what I've built to help others find their footing," he'd written. "Let what was taken from me become something good in your hands." After lunch, we walked through the park. Children ran past with kites, their laughter echoing through the open air. Grandpa stopped by the fountain and looked out across the water. "Do you remember what I told you that day on the curb?" he asked. "That they thought they were rid of me, but they were wrong." I nodded. He smiled faintly. "I wasn't just talking about them. I meant the world. People forget you until you remind them who you are, but you don't do it with noise. You do it with truth." A week later, he left for his first trip, in years a slow journey through the places he'd always wanted to see, but never made time for. Before he boarded the train, he hugged me tightly and whispered, "Take care of the legacy, Hannah. Not the money, the lesson." Then he was gone, walking toward the platform, with that same calm confidence I'd seen the day he walked away from the house. Back home, I started rebuilding in my own way. I used part of the inheritance to fund scholarships for local students, ones like me who'd worked hard but couldn't count on anyone else's help. I reopened Grandpa's old business office and turned it into a small foundation in his name. Some days I still caught myself expecting to hear his voice from the next room, offering quiet advice or a well-timed bit of humor. Even in silence, his presence lingered. As for my parents, I didn't hear from them for a long time. When a letter finally came, it wasn't angry. It was brief, written in my mother's careful handwriting. She said they were living in a small rental near the coast, that they were working again slowly, quietly. There was no apology, just a single line at the end that said, "We hope you're well." It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe that was all it needed to be. On the anniversary of everything that happened, I visited the new family who'd bought the house. They invited me inside for coffee, and as I stood in what used to be the living room, I noticed something simple, a framed picture of my grandfather's garden, which they'd kept after finding it in one of the boxes left behind. "It felt wrong to throw it away," the wife said with a smile. "There's something peaceful about it." I smiled back, knowing he would have liked that. That night, I sat on my porch with the letter he'd written me, the words soft in the lamplight. The air was cool, the sky full of stars, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely still. Everything had come full circle. His dignity restored my voice, found the truth finally standing on its own. Family, I realized, isn't proven by blood or obligation. It's proven by kindness, by respect, by the way you choose to love someone when no one's watching. Grandpa had always known that, even when the rest of us had forgotten. If you've ever had to rebuild after being betrayed or underestimated, remember this: you don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes all it takes is patience, truth, and time. And if this story stayed with you, take a moment to share it or subscribe for more like it. You never know who might need a quiet reminder that justice can come softly and that dignity once reclaimed never fades.